Hi, everybody. Good to see you again. It was really nice to read all of your responses on Flipgrid this week, or to listen to your responses on Flipgrid this week. It was interesting to hear the thoughts that you had about Moises and his teacher and what could have been done in that situation. So I'd like to just take a look at a couple of thoughts that I have to respond to all of your responses. I did leave some responses on the Flipgrid discussion board this week, so go ahead and take a look, see if I had a chance to respond to yours. I had a few things to say to some of you. So let's just take a look at what was in chapter 11 of the textbook this week. This is a list of most of the suggestions that the author had for some strategies that teachers can use when they have ELL students or emergent bilingual students in their classrooms. I think it's important to take a look at really the description of each one of these and what the author has to say. Some of them work in some situations, and I will tell you from personal experiences that some of them don't work in some situations. And so it was interesting to consider Moises' teacher's situation and think really hard about which ones would have worked in some of those clips and which ones might not have worked. So you saw Moises really trying hard with his bilingual dictionary, and we saw that sometimes that worked for him to find, for instance, the translation for a number, and sometimes that didn't work for him when he was trying to explain himself. And some of you did a really great job of saying, for instance, the teacher could have accepted his contribution in his home language and then had a partner up with him to help the rest of the class understand what he had to say. So you can see how some of these possibilities work depending upon the instructional situation, and some of them don't work so well depending upon what the teacher is trying to accomplish. I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things. A couple of you said that you would use concurrent translation as an option for that teacher, and I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the textbook does say that concurrent translation, and that word concurrent means at the same time, right, is not an effective instructional strategy. And the reason for that is if I have an emergent bilingual student in my classroom, let's say, whose home language is Spanish, and I'm speaking in English and then translating to Spanish, and then speaking in English and then translating to Spanish, all of our tendencies, and this is human nature, is to wait for that translation, is to tune out the English and wait for Spanish, because that's easier, right? And all of us as human beings would do that. That would be what we would tend to do. And so we want our students to have access to content in their home language to help them to access that content, but we don't want them to tune out the English, because we do have that goal of them becoming bilingual and biliterate. And so we want them to pick up the English also. And if we're constantly translating for them, they're not going to be able to do that. The other thing to consider is how many language groups of students might you have in your classroom. We here on the border, let me tell you, this is such a strange place to be. And I know that many of you have grown up here your whole lives. I, as a person from the Midwest who didn't grow up here, when I first got here and was in classrooms, I was able to recognize what a different situation we have here, because where I'm from in Minneapolis, you might have a classroom of an ESL classroom, for instance, in middle school or high school, where you have students who speak 15 different languages in your classroom. Imagine that, 15 different home languages. You as a teacher are not going to speak all 15 of those languages, as hard as you might try. And you're not going to have paraprofessionals for each of those children either. And so concurrent translation, even if you wanted to do it, would not be an option for you. And so you need to consider that if you're in New York City or in Chicago or some of these school districts where they have children from all over the world, it's just not going to be a possibility for you. I had a student a few years ago in my classroom who was from Italy, and Italian was her first language. I had a student from Brazil a few years ago, and as much as we think that Portuguese is just like Spanish, it's not. And so it was hard for me to do some of the things that I had done previously with my Spanish-speaking students. The other thing is to think about, are you always going to have access to a paraprofessional for help? And the answer usually is no. And so as much as we would think that we would like to have an extra hand in the classroom, typically you won't have that extra hand to help you out. And so how can you use some of the strategies that the authors talked about here to be creative and to help you do some of these translanguaging strategies in your classroom? So I saw lots of great ideas, like having everything in your classroom labeled for your students, having a cognate word wall. So having that word like bloque for Carlos there would have been so helpful had he been able to have a picture hanging up on the wall to understand what it was that was being talked about, because that is a cognate, right, in English and Spanish. And so having all those visuals hanging for your students is such a great strategy as well. So just some things to think about. We're headed into a week of reading that I know for some of you is going to seem a little bit heavy, but it is really important as you also start to think about taking your certification exam. So I would encourage you to read very carefully this week about some of the legislation that has to do with bilingual education. And I look forward to your comments this week, and have a great rest of your weekend and a great start to this week. Take care, everybody.